In a medieval town, you would find that silence was never quite complete. Even at night, there were sounds that gently filled the air, the soft breathing of animals in nearby stables, the faint tearing sound of rats in the walls, the distant clatter of a guard walking on stone streets. In this world, sleep did not always happen in a bed. Many people slept wherever they could: wooden benches, straw-covered floors, stone steps, and sometimes the cool flagstones of a church. To sleep inside a church was not, at first, a strange thing. Churches were strong buildings. Their walls were thick, made to last centuries. They were warmer than the outdoors in winter, and often cooler in summer. Travelers without money sometimes curled up near the back pews. Poor families who had lost their homes slept quietly in corners. Soldiers resting between duties might place their cloaks on the floor and lie down for a few hours. But in many medieval communities, sleeping in a church too often began to earn a different meaning. You must imagine how closely daily life and religion were joined. The church was not only a place for worship, it was also a court of law, a meeting hall, a school, and sometimes a hospital. The people who ran it, priests and monks, were seen as guardians of both the soul and the mind. When someone spent too much time inside the church while not praying, not working, and not seeking shelter from immediate danger, questions began to rise. There were people who came to the church not just to sleep, but to talk. These individuals were sometimes found lying on their backs, staring up at the stone ceiling, moving their lips quietly. Sometimes their hands moved as if counting invisible beads. Sometimes their eyes followed things that no one else could see. At first, villagers might think such a person was deeply holy. They might whisper that the person had visions, that angels were speaking to them, that God had chosen them for some private message. In a world where miracles were expected and divine signs were taken seriously, this was not unusual. But there was a thin line. If the visions did not match church teachings, if the words spoken did not sound calm or respectful, the meaning shifted. You see, medieval people did not yet divide behavior into medical categories as we do now. There were no clear words for schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, or severe depression. Instead, behavior was judged through moral, religious, and social lenses. If a person spoke softly to the air, and their words were gentle prayers, they were left alone. If they began to mutter in unknown phrases, or to answer voices that no one else heard, fear could replace respect very quickly. This fear was not always cruel. Often, it was practical. A person who could not focus, who could not follow shared reality, could be dangerous in a small, tightly balanced community. A farmer who mistook shadows for spirits might abandon his field. A craftsman who listened to invisible advisors might ruin valuable materials. A guard who heard voices could panic at the wrong moment. So sleeping in the church and speaking to the air slowly became, in some places, a sign of something being wrong rather than something being holy. You can imagine a villager entering the church at dawn. The candles flicker weakly. The stone feels cold even through leather boots. In the far corner, a familiar figure lies wrapped in a cloak. That person has been there every morning for weeks, and still they do not rise from morning work. They do not join the prayers aloud. They only whisper. People would start to watch. Monks kept careful records of unusual behavior. In quiet ink strokes, they sometimes wrote that a woman talked to unseen listeners, that a man woke in the night and argued with empty space. These notes were not meant to be cruel, but to understand. They believed that such people were either touched by divine forces or troubled by dark ones. The common treatment was prayer and supervision. A priest might sit near the person and ask questions in a low voice. He might ask what they saw, what they heard, what words they were told to speak. If the answers matched scripture, the person was treated gently. If the answers wandered, concern deepened. People who slept in the church without permission were sometimes moved outside, not harshly, but firmly. A hand on the shoulder, a quiet instruction, a guiding push toward the door. But those who returned again and again, those who spoke endlessly to the air, sometimes found themselves labeled. The medieval word was not the same as the words used today. They might be called touched, unsettled, distracted, or in some records, simply strange. The idea was that their mind did not sit properly inside their body. What is important is that these were often ordinary people before their habits changed. A mother who once baked bread daily, a shepherd who once walked miles without confusion, a tailor who once stitched clean lines through cloth. They did not suddenly become monsters. They simply drifted. And in that drifting, the community did not know what to do. In cold seasons, the church was still one of the few places where such people could rest safely. Thick stone walls kept out the worst wind. Candles offered a small, steady light. The smell of wax and old wood created a feeling of quiet safety. So they stayed. They spoke. They slept. Some people believed that the stone itself held memories and voices, that old prayers were trapped in the walls. This idea made the behavior seem more understandable. If the church was full of old whispers, perhaps anyone might start to answer them. Others were not so forgiving. They feared that evil forces used silent buildings as doorways. They wondered if a person who muttered alone in a holy place was inviting something dangerous. This fear did not always lead to punishment at first. More often, it led to watching. Neighbors would pause longer than usual near the church door. They would listen. They would exchange glances. They would speak quietly about what they had seen. The person inside would not notice. They were busy answering things that others could not hear. What makes this detail slow and ordinary is that it almost never ended in grand events. There were no dramatic trials most of the time. No crowds, no shouting. Instead, there were many small, quiet moments. A door slowly closing behind a figure, a candle replaced in its holder, a blanket carefully folded. In this way, behavior that now might be seen as mental distress became part of the everyday dull observations of medieval life. It was not exciting. It was not unusual enough to be a story in a grand hall. It was simply something that made people uneasy. And as the weeks passed, one question slowly grew in the minds of those who watched. If someone could not stop speaking to the air, was it because the air truly spoke back, or was it because their mind had wandered somewhere they could not return from? When you remain inside the medieval church long enough, you begin to notice the patterns. The same footsteps each morning, the same cough from an old man who always sat near the door, the same drip of water from a crack in the stone ceiling after rain. It was a place of routine, and that is why unusual behavior became so visible. A person who returned every night, who slept beneath the same archway, who whispered to the same empty space, slowly became part of the architecture in the minds of the villagers, not a guest, not a worshipper, something in between. If you were alive then, you would understand how dangerous being in between could be. Medieval life depended on roles. You were a baker, a farmer, a washer, a shepherd, a priest. Everyone had a place that made sense. It helped others trust you. It helped you survive. When someone no longer fit into a clear place, the uncertainty around them grew. The people sleeping in churches and speaking into empty air often began to lose their original roles. A man who once tilled fields might be left alone to rest more often. A woman who once carried water and washed clothes might be given fewer tasks. This was not always due to cruelty. It was due to fear of unpredictability. People worried that such individuals could not be depended upon. They worried about fires left untended, animals left unfed, doors left unlatched. In small medieval settlements, one small mistake could cost lives. So the church became both a shelter and a kind of quiet holding place. There was no formal system of treatment. There were no hospitals for the mind. There were no specialized healers for strange thoughts. Instead, the care was spiritual. Priests believed that if someone spoke to things that could not be seen, the cause was usually invisible. Angels, demons, spirits of the dead, or divine tests were the explanations they understood. Herbs were sometimes given, but they were meant more to calm the body than the mind. A person might be given warm water mixed with crushed poppy or valerian to make their sleep heavier and their thoughts quieter. They might be encouraged to fast or to eat more regularly, depending on what the local healer believed. But the core of the response was observation. You would have seen monks watching from behind pillars. You would have seen a candle move just slightly closer to keep a person in clearer light. You would have seen an extra blanket placed near them in winter. In church records, quiet notes were made. These were not emotional. They were simple. They stated that a certain person spoke at night, that they replied to no one, that they wept softly, that they laughed without visible reason. These records were often kept because people feared escalation. There was always a concern that quiet whispering might become loud shouting, that harmless conversation with empty air might become agitation, running, breaking, or harming. Yet most of the time, it did not. Most of the time, it stayed subtle, dull, repetitive. The person slept. The person woke. The person whispered. What makes this important in the slow fabric of history is how normal it became. Children grew up seeing these figures in the corners of churches. They accepted it as part of the world. A man who talked to the ceiling, a woman who counted invisible things with her fingers. They did not always fear them. Sometimes they simply stepped around them. There were practical implications too. A church was supposed to be clean and ordered. Merchants came, travelers came, donations were given there. A person living half permanently in the building disrupted the image of stability. So gentle boundaries were created. A quiet rule might forbid sleeping near the altar. Another rule might forbid lying directly in the walking path. Someone might be moved closer to the entrance. Another might be guided toward the back. The words used were careful. Please rest here, not there. Please speak quietly. Please move your bedding. You can imagine how confusing this would feel to someone whose mind was already drifting. To them, the church might feel like the only safe place. Stone walls, familiar echoes, candlelight. Outside was chaos. Rain, mud, loud voices, harsh wind. Inside, there was predictability. People who spoke to the air were often calmer than the villagers who watched them. They lived in their own steady rhythm. The problem was not their suffering alone. It was how their suffering looked to others. The community started to label the pattern rather than the person. Someone who slept in the same place every night and murmured endlessly became known not by name but by behavior. The whisperer, the sleeper, the silent one. These were not official titles, but they shaped identity. There were moments of kindness. Sometimes a woman would leave bread beside a sleeping figure. Sometimes a child would place a flower near their folded hands. Sometimes a monk would speak gently, even when no response came. But kindness in medieval times was careful, always balanced with caution. There were also moments when fear outweighed patience. A person who grew louder at night, who struck walls, who cried out in pain or terror, could be removed. Not beaten, not hunted, but escorted. They might be taken to a family member. If no family remained, they might be walked to the edge of town. That walk was slow. No one wanted it to become a spectacle. What is striking is how often these situations passed without clear resolution. A person might spend years in that half state, known, watched, tolerated, neither healed nor lost. This is the quiet part of history that almost never appears in grand stories. No kings were crowned in those corners. No wars were declared from those whispering mouths, but hundreds of small lives unfolded there, under stone ceilings, beside candle smoke. And with them, the slow, dull question that medieval people never fully answered. Was this kind of behavior a sign of holiness, a punishment, a sickness, or simply another part of being human that they did not yet understand? As years passed in medieval towns, the quiet presence of those who slept in churches and spoke to empty space became something like the steady ticking of a clock. It did not demand attention. It did not create sudden crises. It simply existed. And because it existed for so long, it shaped how communities slowly understood the human mind without ever naming it. If you stood inside one of these stone churches in the late medieval period, you would sense that the building itself had learned to adapt. The cold floors held the faint marks of many resting bodies. The corners where people gathered dusted themselves with straw and bits of thread. The walls grew darker in certain places from years of candle smoke and breath. And in these same places, the people who whispered to the air grew older. Some of them became quieter over time. Their lips moved less. Their gestures softened. They slept more deeply. They became almost like part of the furniture of the church, neither disturbing nor truly participating. Others changed in different ways. A few stopped speaking, but began to rock gently as they sat. A few began to hum rather than whisper. A few stared so long at the ceiling that their eyes reddened and watered. The community adjusted their expectations. In earlier years, people might have tried harder to interpret what was happening. They might have asked if God was speaking. They might have feared a darker origin. But as time went on, many simply accepted that some people lived differently inside their minds. There was no clear concept of mental illness in the sense you understand now, but there was a growing, unspoken agreement that some minds worked differently than others. Not better, not worse, just differently. This understanding did not come from books or teachings. It came from habit. Children grew up seeing these figures as part of ordinary life. A boy might be told to walk quietly past the sleeping man who whispers. A girl might be warned not to interrupt the woman who counts invisible beads. They did not always fear them. They learned to avoid startling them, much like they learned to avoid loud noises near animals. In this way, care became quiet and practical rather than emotional. However, there were moments when this balance broke. Sometimes a traveling priest or official would visit and notice the behavior with fresh eyes. Where the locals saw familiarity, a visitor might see disorder. Where the locals had learned patience, a visitor might see danger. In such moments, change could come quickly. The person sleeping near the altar might be ordered out. The whispering at night might be forbidden. The candle placed nearby might be removed, so the shadows fell deeper. This was not always done with cruelty. Often it was done with a sense of duty. Churches were meant to be places of order. Silence during certain hours was important. The presence of someone who did not fit the expected pattern became a problem to solve. When removed, these individuals did not magically become better. Some found their way to family members, who took them in quietly. Others drifted toward roads and forests. Some ended up in early forms of almshouses, simple shelters for the poor and unwanted. This was the harsh truth of medieval life. There was no organized safety net. There was the church, family, neighbors, and after that, very little. At the same time, not all outcomes were dark. There are records of people who eventually stopped whispering, people who slowly returned to daily tasks, people who left the church and found simple work again, carrying water, sweeping floors, feeding animals. Their return did not come with celebration. There were no announcements, no ceremonies. It was simply noticed one day that they were gone from the corner where they used to sleep. This quiet return is important. It tells you that medieval people sometimes witnessed recovery without understanding it. They did not know why a mind drifted away and why it came back, but they saw that it happened. The ones who did not recover remained part of the landscape of everyday life. Generations passed. The stone walls of churches remained the same, but the thinking of people shifted slowly. By the late medieval period, there were more attempts to categorize behavior. Words began to form for folly, for distraction, for imbalance. Still not medical in the modern sense, but moving closer. Sleeping in churches and speaking to the air came to be seen less as holiness and more as misfortune. There was more sympathy too. People began to understand, in their own quiet way, that such individuals were not choosing this path. They were not lazy, they were not trying to disturb anyone. They were simply struggling in a way that had no clear solution. You, if you were there, might have noticed how normal it all felt. There were no banners, no official notices, no changes that happened overnight. Just slow shifts in understanding. Instead of fear, there was distance. Instead of worship, there was tolerance. Instead of punishment, there was quiet movement toward the door. And always, the whispering. In the final years of the medieval period, some early hospitals began to appear in larger cities. These were not like modern hospitals. They were mostly shelters for the poor and the sick, but a few began to accept those whose minds troubled them. The church slowly gave up this role, not through conflict but through relief. The stone building could return to its rituals, the corners could become empty, the floor could be swept without stepping around sleeping figures. This shift was not perfect. Many people still had nowhere to go. Many still wandered, many still whispered in alleyways instead of churches, but the meaning of their behavior began to move from spiritual mystery toward human struggle. Looking back, what stands out is not the drama but the dullness. No single event marked the end of this behavior being seen as madness or holiness. There was no moment of discovery, no scientific breakthrough, just a slow, tired acceptance that some minds are not quiet, and some people cannot help but speak to things others cannot see. This matters because it shows how long misunderstanding can last, and how gently it sometimes ends. The medieval mind did not solve the problem. It lived alongside it, adjusted to it, and slowly let it change. And today, when you think of someone whispering to the air, sleeping in a quiet corner, lost in their own thoughts, you might ask yourself a question that medieval people never had the language to fully speak. How many of the things once called strange or holy were actually early signs of minds asking for help? And how many of those quiet voices still go unheard in your own time? In a medieval town, laughter was not always a shared sound. You might expect laughter to rise from taverns, from harvest fields, from wedding feasts, and from the slow relief of a long market day. Most laughter was social. It belonged to groups, It marked belonging. But sometimes, laughter appeared where it was not expected. If you were walking down a narrow street of packed dirt and stone, passing wooden houses that leaned slightly toward one another, you might hear it. A soft chuckle, a quiet snort, a sudden burst of laughter from someone standing completely alone. At first, you might think they were greeting a friend, or reacting to a joke whispered too quietly for you to hear. Sound traveled strangely between stone walls, echoes bent easily, illusions were common. But when you turned your head, you would see no one with them. Only a single figure, standing, smiling, or laughing. In medieval life, this was not immediately seen as illness. The world was believed to be full of unseen presences. Angels, spirits, wandering souls, and divine messengers were considered ordinary parts of existence. If someone laughed at something invisible, it could be dismissed as polite behavior toward the unseen world. At least at first. You must understand how small medieval communities were. Everyone knew everyone, not by name alone, but by rhythm. You knew who walked quickly, who shuffled, who coughed, who hummed. You could recognize people by their footsteps alone. When someone began to laugh alone in the street too often, that rhythm broke. You would notice it in subtle ways. A baker pausing longer when handing over bread, a shepherd slowing his steps when passing, a child being gently guided to the other side of the road. It was not fear at first. It was confusion. Laughter carried meaning. It was meant to connect. It was meant to release tension and build trust. When it happened without a visible cause, it unsettled people. In many cases, the person laughing alone had once behaved like everyone else. They had worked. They had traded. They had spoken in the expected tones. Their laughter had once appeared only when something clearly funny had occurred. The change was slow. One quiet laugh in the morning, another in the afternoon, a short burst of amusement while standing by a well. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. But medieval people were careful observers. With little to distract them, they watched patterns very closely. If you saw the same man laughing alone 3 times in 1 week, you would remember. If you saw the same woman smiling to empty air every market day, you would mention it to someone else. There were no newspapers, no announcements, no written warnings. Information moved through whispers. They would say that someone had started laughing for no reason. They would not say madness. They would say something softer. Something was strange. Something had shifted. There was a strong cultural belief that laughter without cause might draw attention from unwanted forces. People feared that laughing with no visible reason was not just confusing but inviting. Inviting spirits. Inviting misfortune. Inviting attention from forces that should remain distant. This belief grew stronger in times of hardship. If there had been poor harvests, disease, or weather damage, tolerance decreased. A person laughing alone might be seen not just as odd, but as dangerous, as someone who did not respect the seriousness of shared suffering. You can imagine a tired villager carrying firewood past such a person. Their back ached. Their stomach was half empty. Their mind was occupied by survival. When someone nearby laughed with no visible reason, it could feel like mockery, even if it was not. This emotional gap created distance. The person laughing alone did not necessarily understand why people stepped away. In their mind, the laughter could be a response to memories, to thoughts, or to inner visions. They were not trying to disturb anyone. They were trying in their own way to survive their thoughts. But no one explained that to the village. There was no shared language for inner experiences. Only visible behavior mattered. In many towns, laughter alone in public started to be associated with divine testing or punishment. People asked quiet questions. They asked what sin might cause a person to laugh without reason. They wondered whether such laughter was joy or torment. Some believed that it was a sign of possession, not always in a dramatic sense, but in a slow, quiet one. They believed that unseen forces could sit inside a mind and twist reactions, turning fear into laughter, turning sadness into sudden joy. Priests were sometimes called to observe, not to punish, but to interpret. A priest might stand nearby and speak softly to the person. They might ask what brought them joy. They might ask what they were thinking. If the answer made sense within religious teaching, the matter might rest. But often, the answers wandered. Someone might say they heard a funny voice, or saw something amusing that disappeared, or felt a sudden warmth that made them laugh. This wandering language increased concern. You would notice that people began to move further away in the streets. Not openly, not with rush or panic. Just a few steps more, a slightly wider path, a longer pause before passing. Shops might hesitate to serve as quickly, not refusing, just hesitating. It was not hatred. It was unease. Children were particularly observant. They watched everything. They sometimes mimicked what they saw. A child might laugh alone and be corrected quickly. Do not do that. People will think something is wrong. In this way, society taught itself what was acceptable without ever writing it down. There were exceptions. Some individuals were known as village harmless. Their laughing alone did not cause fear. It caused mild amusement or pity. These were people who had laughed that way for many years and had never caused harm. But even these people lived on a delicate line. A single sudden outburst louder than usual could change everything. The environment played a role as well. In tight, cramped streets, sound echoed strongly. A laugh bounced between stone walls and sounded louder than it was. To someone already nervous, a small laugh could feel like a sudden burst. In open market squares, laughter alone could feel like disruption. Merchants depended on serious faces, steady hands and predictable behavior. Someone laughing with no visible reason felt out of place among measured trade and quiet negotiations. Over time, laughter began to carry a shadow. You can almost feel the tension if you imagine walking through such a street yourself. Wooden doors slightly open, the smell of smoke and damp wood in the air, the shuffle of feet, then the sound. A soft laugh. Pause. Another laugh. No joke spoken. No companion nearby. And a thought quietly forming in your mind. If they are laughing, what do they see that I cannot? As time passed in medieval towns, the simple act of laughing alone began to collect layers of meaning that had never been intended by the person doing it. What started as a quiet, private reaction slowly became a public concern, not because it was loud or dangerous, but because it could not be explained easily. In a world where most things were understood through shared experience, anything that could not be shared became suspicious. You would notice that the villagers stopped asking the person why they were laughing. At first, people might have asked gently, "What has made you happy? What have you seen?" But after weeks and months of the same behavior, questions faded. Curiosity turned to distance. The first real change was subtle. Work invitations became less frequent. The person who once helped stack wood or carry water might no longer be called upon. Not because they were hated, but because people did not trust how steady they were. A laugh at the wrong moment could feel like a crack in the stability of a fragile routine. When survival depended on timing, predictability, and quiet cooperation, any unpredictable behavior became a quiet threat. Medieval towns had few distractions. There were no printed stories, no public entertainment most days, no noise except what people made themselves. This meant that even small behaviors were magnified. A laugh that would be ignored in a busy modern crowd stood out sharply in a medieval street. You would hear it echo. You would see heads turn. You would feel the air tighten slightly. There were no formal systems to decide what to do with a person like this, so people began to handle it through custom. The customs were not written, but everyone learned them. First avoidance, then whispering, then quiet labeling. The person would stop being seen as their trade and become known by their behavior, the laughing one, the strange one, the smiling one. Their identity slowly shifted from who they had been to what they now displayed. This shift had real consequences. Bargaining became less fair, conversations became shorter, faces turned away more quickly. What is important to understand is that many medieval people believed laughter was a physical sign of the soul. It was not just an emotional response. It was believed to be connected to moral balance. Too little laughter meant sorrow of spirit. Too much meant disorder. Controlled laughter was valued. Some religious teachings suggested that laughter should be restrained. That too much joy was dangerous. That constant seriousness showed spiritual strength. When someone laughed alone without reason, it appeared to break this discipline. In difficult times, this fear grew stronger. During times of disease or hunger, there was less tolerance for behaviors that did not support survival. A person laughing alone might be seen as disrespecting the hardship of others. Even if the laughter came from inner confusion or pain, it was interpreted from the outside as carelessness. This created isolation. You can imagine the experience of such a person, walking through familiar streets, feeling eyes remain on them longer than before, hearing conversations stop when they came close, sensing the gap widening. They might not understand what they had done wrong. In their mind, laughter could be a relief, a sudden release from pressure, a response to thoughts that no one else could see. But medieval society had no language for that inner world. Only what could be seen mattered. There were also attempts to explain the behavior through physical causes. Some early medical thinkers believed that imbalance of bodily fluids caused excessive laughter. They spoke of humors, of too much warmth in the blood, of wind trapped in the body. A local healer might recommend cold water, or bitter herbs, or bloodletting, not out of cruelty, but out of a genuine belief that the body needed balance. You might see someone who laughed alone, being guided to a bench, their arm gently held while a healer prepared a small blade, a bowl placed beneath. It was slow, quiet, treated as normal care. These treatments did not always help. Sometimes they made the person weaker, more tired, more confused, and more laughter would follow. Over time, laughter became more closely linked with instability in the minds of observers. They began to expect trouble if the laughter continued. They watched for changes in walking, in eating, in sleeping. If a person laughed alone and also stopped working, the concern deepened. If they laughed and then cried suddenly, fear grew. In small towns, fear is like fog. It moves quietly and covers everything without noise. People began teaching their children not to stare, not to point, not to ask questions. These instructions were not kind or cruel. They were practical. Draw no attention. Do not disturb. Stay safe. There were still small moments of kindness. An old woman might hand a piece of bread without speaking. A neighbor might leave a cup of water nearby and walk away. These were gestures of care done at a distance. But the emotional wall remained. As years passed, this behavior began to shift in meaning in some areas. Instead of being seen as a sign of spiritual trouble, it started to be seen as a permanent state. People stopped expecting it to change. They stopped trying to understand. They simply accepted that some people laughed alone and always would. This kind of acceptance had two sides. On one hand, it reduced fear. On the other, it increased isolation. When someone becomes a permanent feature of a street, they stop being seen as a full person. They become part of the background. You would step around them like a puddle. You would walk past them like a broken stone. And that is a quiet kind of loneliness. Still, medieval life moved on. Markets opened and closed. Seasons changed. Harvests came and failed. Wars began and ended far away. And always in the streets, somewhere, someone laughed without visible reason. Priests grew less likely to intervene unless the laughter grew violent or disruptive. They began to see that prayer alone could not remove it. They watched instead of acted. The behavior became simply one of many strange patterns of human life that no one fully understood. The more time passed, the less anyone tried to fix it. That quiet surrender is one of the dullest parts of history, but also one of the most telling. People did not always solve what they did not understand. Sometimes they simply stepped aside and let it exist. And yet, under this surface calm, another question began to form. If laughter without reason was treated as something unchangeable, what happened inside the minds of those who laughed, and how much of their true experience was lost because no one knew how to ask? As you remain in the medieval world, you begin to notice that the behaviors once praised as sacred devotion rarely ended in dramatic miracles or public revelations. Instead, most lives shaped by extreme fasting, long silences, and solitary prayer faded quietly, marked by exhaustion, illness, and gradual withdrawal from the world. These endings were not recorded in grand chronicles. They survived in monastery notes, whispered memories, and sparse entries in church account books. For many individuals, the final stage of these behaviors was not celebrated holiness, but physical collapse. Prolonged fasting weakened bodies in ways medieval people could not fully understand. You would see people whose skin grew thin and pale, whose hair thinned, and whose muscles weakened. Hands trembled during prayer, breathing became shallow, vision blurred. Yet these symptoms were often interpreted not as illness, but as evidence that the soul was loosening its attachment to the body. Monastic communities sometimes admired those who endured such visible suffering. You might hear brothers whisper that a frail monk was growing closer to heaven. A woman in a convent who refused food for long periods might be described as touched by divine grace. However, behind the reverence was a practical reality. These individuals required care. They had to be supported while walking. They had to be helped to sit. They had to be watched in case they fainted during prayer. Slowly, a more complicated understanding began to form. Some monastery leaders started recording concerns about extreme behaviors. They did not have modern concepts of mental illness, but they recognized patterns. A monk who never slept, who spoke only in religious phrases, and who injured himself during prayer was not always seen as holy. Sometimes he was gently guided away from the most severe practices. He might be ordered to eat more, to spend time working in gardens or kitchens, or to sleep under supervision. These corrections were not framed as medical care. They were described as spiritual discipline. The idea was to bring a person back into balance, not to cure an illness. If someone resisted, the explanation was that the individual was fighting inner temptation, not that he was experiencing psychological distress. In small villages, the story often ended differently. Without monasteries to offer structure, people with intense religious behaviors lived among neighbors who did not always understand them. You might see a man who fasted so severely he could no longer farm his land. You might see a woman who refused to speak for years, communicating only through hand gestures and prayers written on scraps of parchment. These individuals were sometimes tolerated and sometimes feared. Children were warned to be respectful but cautious. Adults might leave small offerings of bread or water outside their doors. Over time, as harvests failed or illnesses spread, the same individuals might become targets of suspicion. People began to wonder whether extreme holiness was actually a sign of divine favor or divine warning. As the centuries moved forward, the church itself slowly shifted its view. Church councils tried to bring uniformity to religious life. Manuals were written to guide behavior. You would find passages advising moderation, regular meals, and structured prayer. While miracles and visions were still respected, there was growing concern about uncontrolled behaviors that disrupted daily life within religious communities. Yet the deeper question remained unanswered. No one truly separated spiritual experience from mental suffering. If a person heard voices, they were guided to test whether the voices were holy or demonic. The possibility that the voices came from within the mind was not part of the accepted framework. If a person could not sleep, could not stop speaking prayers, or could not stop fasting, the explanation remained spiritual struggle. When death came to these individuals, it often came quietly. Some died in their sleep after years of self-denial. Some fell during prayer and never rose again. Their funerals were modest. A few lines were entered into records, describing them as devoted or troubled, depending on the view of the person writing. Despite their quiet endings, the influence of these behaviors lasted for generations. Stories were told to novices. Parents warned children about extreme devotion. At the same time, folk memory preserved tales of holy men and women who lived without food or speech for astonishing lengths of time. These stories shaped expectations of what holiness looked like, even as the official church tried to guide people toward moderation. As the medieval period moved toward its later centuries, early forms of medical thinking began to reappear in Europe. Ancient Greek and Roman medical texts were copied and studied in monasteries and early universities. These texts suggested that the mind and body were connected through balance of fluids and physical conditions. While still far from modern psychology, this was a small step toward understanding. You would begin to notice subtle changes. A person who refused to eat might be seen as suffering from an imbalance of humors rather than pure spiritual zeal. A person who spoke endlessly to unseen beings might be described as overheated in the mind. Treatments were still crude: herbal remedies, bloodletting, warm baths, quiet rooms, but the idea that behavior could come from the body as well as the soul slowly grew. Even so, the older explanations never disappeared. For most people, the line between holiness and illness remained thin. A fasting mystic could still be seen as chosen by heaven in one town, and as dangerously unbalanced in another. The inconsistency was part of daily medieval life. From your vantage point, the lasting impact of these lives is clear. They shaped how communities understood suffering. They shaped how people thought about discipline, self-control, and the meaning of pain. The quiet individuals who harmed their bodies in pursuit of purity influenced doctrine, folklore, and daily habits for centuries. They also left a legacy of caution. Later religious leaders often pointed to these extreme examples when teaching moderation. The idea slowly took root that devotion did not always require suffering, and that stability could be a form of holiness. But this realization took generations and was never complete. Now, looking back across the narrow monastery corridors, the dim candlelit rooms, and the silent villages, you can see how these normal behaviors from the medieval world were deeply intertwined with what would one day be recognized as mental illness. But in their own time, they were lived as faith, duty, and survival in a world that offered few explanations and fewer comforts. The question that remains is this: if even sincere devotion could slowly turn into silent suffering, how many other ordinary medieval lives were shaped by conditions no one yet had a name for? You find yourself walking through a medieval village at the slow, steady pace of daily life. The air smells of damp earth, wood smoke, and boiled grains. Most sounds are simple: footsteps on packed soil, the lowing of cattle, the steady tapping of looms inside timber houses. Words, in this world, are usually measured. People choose them carefully because speech carries weight. To speak too much is to invite attention, and attention can be dangerous. In this setting, silence is normal. Long pauses in conversation are not awkward. They are expected. When people speak, they often do so softly and briefly. A question is asked, a short answer given, a blessing murmured. You notice that the rhythm of speech is controlled, slow, and purposeful. Against this background of restraint, the rare individuals who cannot stop talking stand out in a way that is difficult to miss. Their voices rise quickly. Their words tumble out in streams that seem to have no end. They speak while walking. They speak while eating. They speak to walls, animals, beams of light, or empty air. In the medieval world, this behavior is not understood as a medical condition. It is seen as something far more serious and far more frightening. People believe that speech comes from the soul. Words are not just sounds. They are breath shaped by divine will. When speech becomes uncontrollable, it is believed that something else has entered the soul. The most common explanation is possession. The person is thought to be influenced, or even overtaken by spirits, demons, or restless forces. You would see this belief play out in homes, churches, and marketplaces. A woman who speaks in long, rapid phrases without pause is not described as ill. She is described as troubled by a spirit. A man who cannot stop muttering prayers, curses, or disconnected ideas is not considered confused. He is considered touched by an unseen hand. This belief shapes how the community responds. There are no doctors of the mind. There are no quiet treatment rooms. There is only ritual and fear. The local priest may be called. He listens carefully to the flow of words. He searches for blasphemy, revelations, or unnatural knowledge. Holy water is prepared. Prayers are spoken. You can imagine standing quietly in the corner of a small chapel as such a ritual takes place. The person sits on a wooden bench. Candles flicker. The smell of wax and old stone fills the air. The priest speaks in a measured voice while the affected person continues their endless stream of words. There is no anger here, only tension. A silent question hangs in the air. Is this soul under attack? Sometimes the community interprets excessive speech in a more hopeful way. There is a thin line between possession and prophecy. If the words sound pious, if they contain scripture, visions, or warnings, the speaker might be seen as chosen rather than cursed. A person who speaks constantly about heaven, angels, or divine commands might become a figure of curiosity rather than fear. Yet, this fascination is fragile. One wrong phrase can shift opinion. If the speech becomes too strange, too dark, or too critical of authority, the tone changes. What was once tolerated becomes threatening. Inside monasteries, this behavior takes on another layer. Monastic life is built on silence. You see monks walking in long corridors, speaking only when required. Words are considered precious. They are not wasted. A monk who cannot stop talking is breaking one of the most sacred rules. At first, the behavior might be treated as a spiritual test. The abbot may believe the monk is being tempted by inner demons of pride or distraction. The solution is more prayer, more fasting, and more isolation. The monk may be asked to sit alone in a small stone cell with only bread and water. You can picture this cell: rough stone walls, a narrow slit of light, a wooden stool, a thin blanket. The idea is that silence will be restored through discipline. But for some individuals, the isolation only makes the problem more visible. Alone in the darkness, the words continue. They whisper to the stone. They speak into the cold air. Without modern understanding, this endless speech becomes a spiritual mystery. Why can this person not stop? Why do the words appear like a river that never dries? In small towns, the same behavior appears in simpler surroundings. A man at the well talks without pause. Women drawing water avoid his gaze. Children listen from a distance. He might be tolerated for years, living quietly at the edge of social life. But if his words begin to include accusations, warnings, or strange instructions, fear spreads. People begin to worry that he can see things they cannot, that he is guided by forces they cannot control. The constant talking becomes dangerous, not because of the noise, but because of what people believe the words might represent. There are no written medical records to explain what happens inside these minds. No labels, no diagnoses, no understanding of anxiety, mania, or disorders of thought. Instead, there is only interpretation through religious and cultural belief. The behavior becomes a story the community tells itself, a story about spirits, tests of faith, and unseen battles. You begin to see how ordinary medieval life had no room for behaviors that broke its rhythm. Silence was stability. Control was virtue. Anything that rushed, spilled over, or expanded beyond those boundaries felt like a crack in the order of the world. Yet, these individuals were not rare. Manuscripts and sermons mention people who could not stop speaking, not as medical curiosities, but as moral examples. They were used to teach lessons about discipline, humility, and spiritual danger. Their real inner suffering was never named. Behind the fear and ritual, quieter realities existed. These people often felt exhausted. Their minds raced, their bodies tired, their voices grew hoarse. They slept poorly, but no one asked about their inner experience. Only the meaning of their words was questioned. As you stand in this medieval world and listen to the flowing, unstoppable speech of one such person, you begin to sense a larger truth. This behavior was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it happened more often than people recorded. Extraordinary because it challenged everything the medieval world believed about the quiet, ordered nature of a proper soul. The village continues its slow routine around this constant voice. Bread is baked, fields are tilled, bells ring, life moves forward, even as the words never seem to end. And you are left with a quiet, unresolved thought lingering in the air like smoke in a low-ceilinged room. If speaking without stopping was seen as invasion by unseen forces, what happened when the voice in someone's mind never stayed silent, even when their lips finally did? You remain in the medieval world, where constant speech is not simply an oddity but a mystery that unsettles the steady rhythm of village and cloister life. Over time, the way people respond to unending talk becomes more structured, not because they understand it, but because they fear it. The words of such people are no longer treated as random sounds. They become evidence in an imagined trial between unseen forces. When a person speaks without stopping, the community begins to listen for patterns. You can picture villagers standing just out of sight, pretending to busy themselves while their ears remain fixed on the speaker's voice. They look for words that hint at hidden knowledge, names of places never visited, secrets not publicly known, complaints about figures of authority. The fear is not only that the person is unwell, but that they are receiving information from something beyond the human world. The church becomes the central place where these fears are sorted. Priests are trained not in psychology, but in discernment of spirits. You would see them ask careful, formal questions. Do the voices speak of God? Do they curse the holy? Do they predict disaster? The person who cannot stop talking often answers without control, spilling thoughts in tangled flows. The priest listens not for meaning, but for signs of danger. If the speech seems chaotic but harmless, the response stays mild. Extra prayers, fasting prescribed in small, controlled ways, a blessing with holy water, a charm of parchment tied to the wrist. These acts are meant to protect, not to punish. But if the speech turns toward criticism of church authority, or strange warnings about calamity, the tone changes. The person is no longer treated as merely troubled. They are seen as a risk to the spiritual safety of the entire community. In extreme cases, stronger rituals are used. The word exorcism begins to circulate among frightened whispers. You can imagine the atmosphere of such a moment. Heavy wooden doors shut, candles lit in a shaky circle of light, the smell of incense rising until the air becomes thick. The person speaks in streams that grow faster, not slower, and yet the ritual continues, because this is the only tool the medieval world has. Inside monasteries, where silence is law, the treatment becomes harsher through isolation rather than ritual. A monk who endlessly talks may be told to take vows of complete silence. He is forbidden from speaking, even when the words push against his lips. His meals are brought to him without eye contact. He works alone. he sleeps alone. The hope is that forced quiet will bring peace to the mind. But for many, silence becomes its own torment. The words do not disappear, they change their place. They move inward. Instead of a voice that escapes the mouth, the thoughts crowd inside the head, with no way to release them. Anxiety grows. The face tightens, the eyes dart, the body becomes tense, as if bracing against a storm only it can feel. In villages, people without religious protection face simpler, harsher outcomes. You would see a man who talks endlessly, slowly pushed further to the edge of social life. He is not invited to gatherings. He is avoided at wells and markets. Children are told to stay away from him, not because he is violent, but because he is unpredictable. Work becomes difficult. Employers do not want distraction. Noise is seen as weakness. In a world that relies on careful coordination for farming, baking, and craft work, constant speech is disruptive. Slowly, the person loses opportunities to contribute. Without work, their survival becomes uncertain. Families try to help in the only ways they know. A sister might tie a ribbon around the man's wrist blessed by a local priest. A mother might whisper prayers into his ear while he sleeps. A father might grow impatient, believing the constant talking is a sign of moral failure rather than suffering. Over time, the person learns small survival strategies. They speak more softly when around others. They learn to mouth words without sound. They find secluded places where their voice can flow without drawing attention, like forests, empty barns, or riverbanks. These quiet strategies are not taught. They are learned through pain and avoidance. The words themselves often change over the years. In youth, they may be lively and scattered. In middle life, they become weary and repetitive. Prayers repeated again and again, phrases that circle back on themselves, fragments of conversation long past. With no one to guide or calm the inner storm, the mind fills itself with what it can gather. Records of this behavior appear only indirectly in medieval writings. Sermons warn against people who speak too much. Moral manuals advise control of the tongue as a path to salvation. Hagiographies mention saints tempted by endless inner speech, but none of these sources describe the inner experience. They describe the moral lesson. You begin to sense how heavy the loneliness must have been. Imagine living in a world where silence equals virtue and speech equals danger, yet your mind refuses to be silent. Every thought presses forward, every image demands words, and the more you speak, the further you fall from safety and acceptance. There is no concept of therapy, no listening ear trained to help untangle racing thoughts, no place designed to soothe the restless mind. Instead, there is prayer, superstition, fear, and endurance. Still, life does not stop. Seasons turn, crops are harvested, bells mark the hours. Even those who constantly speak find ways to exist alongside this slow, repetitive rhythm. Some become known figures, like living warnings. Others disappear quietly into isolation, remembered only vaguely by neighbors. In rare instances, people begin to notice that these individuals are not evil or dangerous. They see kindness behind the flood of words. A man who cannot stop talking might still help repair a fence. A woman who murmurs constantly might still care for animals with gentle hands. Small acts of humanity soften suspicion in a few hearts. But the larger cultural belief never fully shifts. Words are still treated as proof of unseen struggle. Excessive speech remains categorized as spiritual danger or moral weakness, not as human suffering deserving care. Standing again in the shadow of a stone church, you can hear a familiar pattern. The priest's low voice, the murmured prayers, the endless stream of speech from the troubled soul, the flicker of candlelight across worn faces. Everyone is trying to understand something they cannot name. And still the deeper question lingers, heavier than before. If speaking too much was seen as proof of spirits battling for control, how did medieval people understand the quiet minds that fought the same battles without ever letting a single word escape? By the late medieval period, the endless speech that once commanded attention and fear had begun to settle into a quieter pattern, though not because the minds themselves had changed. Rather, the communities had adapted. Villagers and monks alike learned the careful art of coexistence, of living alongside someone whose words never stopped yet posed no direct threat. The constant talker became, in a way, a fixture of the environment, like the town well or the ancient oak at the market square, both noticed and tolerated without question. In monasteries, priests began to document these cases in simple factual records. the monk who spoke without pause, the woman who whispered constantly in the refectory, the child who recited prayers day and night. The entries are brief, lacking emotion, focused on patterns of behavior, often noting when intervention was attempted. These notes were practical, not medical. They reflected concern, not understanding. The words recorded were meant to observe, not to interpret. But centuries later, they offer a quiet glimpse into lives otherwise invisible to history. The practical methods used to manage excessive speech evolved slowly. Some were gentle, structured routines, quiet tasks, solitary work that allowed expression without social disruption. Others were harsher, isolation, forced silence, fasting, or ritualistic interventions meant to purify or control the individual. None were particularly effective in altering the underlying compulsion to speak. What changed most was perception. The person became part of the accepted background. Their speech, once startling, became a low hum against the backdrop of medieval life. Even in villages outside monastic walls, this pattern repeated. Merchants, neighbors, and family members learned not to expect silence, but to navigate around the talking individual. A man who could not stop speaking might continue to fetch water, repair fences, or assist with chores, but always accompanied by murmured caution and distance. Children were taught early to step aside, to listen without judgment, and to maintain a polite awareness of voices that no one could truly interpret. What was once alarming became mundane, the unusual absorbed into the rhythm of everyday life. Yet beneath this quiet acceptance lay continued struggle. Many who spoke without pause lived lives marked by isolation, exhaustion, and misunderstanding. The physical toll of constant speech, throat soreness, fatigue, sleep deprivation, was compounded by social estrangement. Yet for all the difficulties, survival was possible, and in many cases, these individuals lived decades in relative stability, neither punished nor fully understood, their internal world hidden behind a constant exterior noise. Remarkably, these cases also shaped the cultural imagination. They influenced sermons, moral lessons, and folklore. Tales of unstoppable voices became warnings of pride, temptation, and spiritual danger, but they also highlighted endurance and human resilience. Communities learned a quiet tolerance, and the broader society slowly began to recognize that not all unusual behaviors were willful or malicious. The voices that could not be silenced carried lessons about the limits of understanding, the patience required for coexistence, and the subtle ways humans adapt to one another. By the time the Renaissance began, early medical texts were introduced that hinted at explanations beyond the spiritual humoral imbalances, nervous disorders, and the first glimmers of psychological insight. While these ideas would take centuries to fully develop, the medieval legacy of the endlessly speaking individual left its imprint. It showed that behaviors later labeled as mental illness had long existed, quietly shaping social norms, spiritual interpretation, and human compassion. If you pause now, you can almost imagine a street in a small medieval town, or a shadowed monastery corridor. The soft murmur of unending words drifts past, unnoticed by most but persistent and alive. You realize that these lives, often overlooked, mattered not because they were dramatic, but because they taught patience, tolerance, and the quiet endurance of communities and individuals alike. And so the question that medieval people never fully answered remains: when a mind refuses to stop speaking, what is required of those around it? The wisdom to intervene, the patience to endure, or the courage to accept that some voices will always be beyond understanding. Imagine a medieval town at dawn. Mist rises from the river, curling around the wooden houses and narrow streets. Smoke drifts from chimneys. The town is still mostly asleep. The first sound is the creak of carts on cobblestones, the lowing of cattle, the distant hammering from the blacksmith's workshop. Life in these towns moves slowly, and movement is deliberate. Every step has purpose. Every action measured. Predictability is the rhythm of survival. Into this rhythm walks a figure who does not follow it. You see a person pacing, slowly at first, then faster, round and round the same small square, along the walls of the town, through the same alleys. Their gaze flicks left, right, and back again. Sometimes they mutter words under their breath. Sometimes they are silent. Their movement is continuous, endless. Medieval people noticed such patterns quickly. Villages were small. Everyone knew each other's habits. If a man usually left the house at dawn to fetch water, his absence was quickly noted. If a woman normally walked to the market at mid-morning, neighbors would remark if she appeared elsewhere at odd hours. repetition that did not fit the communal pattern, was immediately suspicious. Walking in circles was seen as more than eccentricity. It could be a sign of restlessness, obsession, or spiritual unrest. Some believed the person was cursed, or that a demon compelled their feet to move without pause. Others considered it a mark of divine testing, a soul unsettled and seeking purpose or penance. No one saw it as a symptom of mental or physical fatigue. The medieval worldview offered explanations in terms of morality, spirituality, or supernatural influence, not health. Children learned quickly to step aside when someone paced near the village square. A market vendor would pause mid-sale, watching the pacing figure with a careful measured distance. The rhythm of the community adjusted itself subtly. Movement that could interrupt trade, prayer, or work was tolerated but observed. Monasteries presented a different perspective. Within cloistered walls, pacing was disruptive in an entirely new way. Silence was law, and prayer and labor were structured with exacting precision. A monk who could not stop walking threatened the order itself. The abbot might observe silently at first. If pacing continued, the monk could be asked to sit, to kneel, or to engage in work requiring stillness. Some individuals adapted their movement to social spaces. Courtyards became their private arenas. Corridors were circumnavigated in long loops. Sometimes a rope or staff was used to mark the circle. Others were confined to small rooms for hours. These interventions were not cruel, at least not intentionally. They were practical measures to maintain order and prevent disturbance. But confinement often worsened the internal struggle. Restless feet could not stop. Thoughts accelerated, anxiety or agitation grew. The medieval observer had no framework for understanding these sensations. The person's visible behavior, the walking, was all that mattered. There was no concept of mental fatigue, of compulsion, of inner agitation, only movement and interpretation through morality, superstition, and religious belief. Villagers began to tell stories about these individuals. In quiet moments by the hearth, parents warned children about restless spirits or the dangers of wandering too much. Tales spoke of people who paced endlessly, unable to stop, haunted by divine vision or demonic persuasion. These stories were cautionary. They taught obedience and vigilance. They also ensured that the observed individual's behavior remained a subject of communal awareness, though rarely of sympathy. Markets, streets, and courtyards slowly reshaped themselves around these figures. Merchants would place carts to guide or restrict movement. Children would learn the safest routes to avoid interference. The pacing person became part of the landscape, both noticed and ignored, both integrated and isolated. Some scholars of the later medieval period began to speculate on causes. Humors, balance of the elements in the body, and internal heat were sometimes mentioned in treatises. Excessive movement might be blamed on too much choler or bile, on internal restlessness of the blood or wind. Remedies ranged from calming herbs to guided exercise. Often, the advice was imprecise, sometimes harmful, but it reflected an emerging recognition that the body as well as the spirit could influence behavior. Despite these early ideas, the pacing remained enigmatic. There were no structured interventions, no understanding of compulsion or anxiety. The person walked, the town adjusted, and life continued. Over weeks, months, and years, these patterns became familiar. Children grew up, knowing the paths to avoid. Neighbors learned the timing of the rounds. The pacing figure became part of the slow, measured rhythm of daily life, both ordinary and extraordinary at once. And yet, a question always lingered in the back of every observer's mind. Why could this soul not rest? Why could these feet not pause? And how many silent struggles went unseen, because no one knew what to ask? As the days and weeks passed in the medieval village, the pacing figure became less of a sudden curiosity and more of a quiet fixture, yet the reactions of those around them remained cautious and wary. Life in small towns relied on predictability. Markets ran on schedule, work in the fields required coordination, and neighbors depended on each other for safety and survival. Anything that disrupted the shared rhythm, whether laughter, endless talking, or pacing, was noticed immediately, and the unknown element of the behavior bred subtle fear. For the pacing individual, life was a continuous loop, both literal and mental. Steps traced familiar paths, the edges of the town square, along the riverbank, around the perimeter of fields. But the movement was rarely mechanical. Each step seemed tethered to an invisible tension, a need to release some internal pressure that no one could see. The rest of the town might interpret the walking as obsession, compulsion, or a mark of possession, but in truth it was both mind and body trying to find balance in a world that offered no explanations. You can imagine the physical toll. Stone and dirt streets were hard underfoot. Shoes were simple, often made of rough leather, providing minimal protection. Feet grew sore, joints stiffened, muscles ached. The pacing person might have bruises or cuts unnoticed by the rest of the town, and sleep was frequently disrupted because the mind continued to wander even when the body could rest. Yet, outwardly, their behavior was judged primarily by its visibility. Pain and exhaustion mattered less than whether the steps disturbed others or broke communal expectations. In some families, efforts were made to gently intervene. A father might guide a son toward work or tasks that required sitting. A mother might try to distract a daughter with chores, prayers, or conversation. But these attempts were often met with resistance. The need to walk was internal, urgent, and invisible. When the pacing was temporarily interrupted, the inner agitation often returned even stronger. Priests and healers sometimes became involved, especially if the behavior was extreme or persistent. Their approach reflected the medieval worldview movement could be influenced by imbalance of humors, spiritual unrest, or demonic interference. Remedies varied widely: herbs to calm the body, mild physical restraint, rituals to purify the soul, or enforced periods of rest and reflection were common. None were consistently effective, because the cause was neither fully physical nor fully spiritual, and no one had the language or knowledge to describe what they were observing. Despite these challenges, pacing was rarely punished outright. The behavior was disruptive, but not violent. Villagers learned to live with it, adjusting their routines. Markets adapted their stalls, doors were left open for safe passage, and children were taught which paths to avoid. The pacing figure was marginalized in subtle ways, yet integrated enough that the town's life could continue. Social isolation existed, but rarely in the form of overt cruelty. Instead, it was a slow, quiet distancing, fewer invitations, shorter conversations, limited interaction. Interestingly, the act of pacing sometimes served a social function unknown to observers. It allowed the individual to maintain presence and visibility without confrontation. By walking constantly, they remained a living part of the town without needing to interact directly. Their movement became a form of communication itself, a statement that they existed, that they participated, even if in a manner the community struggled to understand. In monastic settings, pacing was even more complex. Monks were bound by rules of silence and structured activity. A monk who could not stay still posed challenges to the daily order. The abbot might assign repetitive tasks or solitary work to contain the movement, but each intervention carried the risk of increasing internal agitation. In this context, the pacing monk highlighted the tension between obedience and compulsion, between spiritual aspiration and human limitation. There were rare accounts in medieval manuscripts, noting that some pacing individuals eventually developed coping strategies. They learned to map their paths to minimize disruption, to synchronize with natural rhythms of town life, and even to use walking as a form of meditation or reflection. These adaptations were self-taught, born from necessity rather than instruction, and they allowed the person to persist in daily life without overt conflict. Yet, despite these small victories, the larger reality remained. Communities continued to interpret pacing through the lens of morality, spirituality, and superstition. Endless steps were considered evidence of internal imbalance, of spiritual unrest, or of demonic influence. No one recognized the mental and emotional strain behind the movement. What was internal and invisible was judged only by its external manifestation. The town continued to move around the pacing figure. Life went on. Crops were planted and harvested. Children grew. Bells marked the hours. Yet the quiet tension lingered. Observers knew that while the body could be seen, the mind remained largely inaccessible. Every step taken was a question unanswered, a struggle witnessed but never fully understood. And so the unresolved thought lingers, in a world without explanations for unseen pressures, how many lives were quietly consumed by behaviors that society could observe but not comprehend? How many feet traced circles in silence, carrying burdens no one could name, leaving stories unrecorded, except in the briefest of notes, whispers, or memories? By the later medieval period, pacing, once alarming and mysterious, had become a quietly acknowledged part of village and monastic life. The individuals who walked in endless loops were no longer treated as sudden threats or signs of immediate possession. Instead, They became fixtures, moving through streets, cloisters, and courtyards like living instruments of the town's rhythm. People adapted, life adjusted, yet the deeper human story, the inner struggle of body and mind, remained largely invisible. The physical consequences of persistent pacing were profound. Feet and legs bore constant strain, joints stiffened, skin rubbed raw against simple footwear. Sleep was often fitful, interrupted by the need to continue walking or the mental restlessness that prevented complete rest. Yet outwardly, these individuals were judged only by the continuity of their movement. Strength, endurance, and endurance of discomfort became unnoticed constants, survival quietly sustained in the absence of understanding. Communities continued to manage pacing with subtle measures, rather than overt intervention. Paths were altered, market routes adjusted, and houses positioned to allow passage without disruption. Monks in cloisters learned to anticipate pacing routes, designing chores and prayer schedules to minimize interference. Families and neighbors avoided confrontation while offering minimal support. A piece of bread, a whispered greeting, or a space cleared along a narrow street. These strategies were practical, born of necessity, rather than understanding. Priests and healers sometimes attempted to offer remedies, herbs to calm the body, ritual prayers, or small acts of spiritual guidance were applied with sincerity, though rarely successful in stopping the behavior. Occasionally, confinement or solitary work was used as a corrective measure, intended to restore spiritual or physical balance. For some individuals, these interventions were effective temporarily. For others, they heightened tension, creating inner frustration that expressed itself through even more persistent walking. Yet, in rare instances, the pacing found a fragile harmony. Some individuals discovered patterns in their movement that allowed them to coexist with their environment. Courtyards, pathways, and streets became mapped arenas. They learned to synchronize steps with the daily rhythm of the town, avoiding crowds, moving when others were occupied, and retreating to secluded areas when necessary. Walking became a form of endurance, a method of coping with a mind that refused stillness, a quiet assertion of presence in a world that demanded order. Stories and manuscripts from the period preserve glimpses of this coexistence. Chroniclers describe pacing individuals in neutral tones, focusing on the observable fact rather than internal experience. Tales warn of restless spirits or divine testing, but also note resilience, the ability to persist, to maintain life and routine, despite continuous physical and emotional strain. Pacing, once a sign of danger or divine intervention, was gradually normalized as an enduring, if puzzling, human pattern. The social consequences of pacing remained subtle but profound. Individuals were often isolated socially, invited to gatherings less frequently, or observed quietly from a distance. Children were warned to avoid unpredictable footsteps. Neighbors adjusted expectations, learning to navigate without confrontation. These adaptations allowed the individual to survive within the community, even without understanding or empathy from those around them. From a modern perspective, pacing in medieval life illuminates a quiet truth. Behaviors we now might classify as anxiety, compulsion, or other mental conditions were historically interpreted through the lenses of morality, spirituality, and superstition. Medieval society lacked the language to describe inner experience, yet it developed mechanisms of coexistence. Tolerance, avoidance, and subtle adaptation became the tools by which communities managed what they could neither control nor fully comprehend. Looking across the centuries, the endurance of these individuals demonstrates human resilience in its simplest, most understated form. The feet that traced circles day after day, the bodies worn by constant motion, and the minds restless with unspoken thoughts, all survived in a society that offered no labels, no sympathy, and no medical intervention. Their survival was quiet, uncelebrated, yet remarkable. And as you leave the village square, imagining the fading footsteps in the dust, a final question remains. If walking in circles could shape the rhythms of entire communities, what unseen patterns have always existed beneath the surface of ordinary life, influencing survival, adaptation, and the slow, unnoticed history of human endurance? In a small medieval village, the morning sun barely lights the narrow lanes, and the town is quiet except for the familiar sounds of daily life. The clatter of carts, the bleating of goats, the distant hammering from the blacksmith, all are ordinary, predictable, and reassuring. Yet, even in this routine, certain behaviors immediately set people apart. One of the most peculiar, and often misunderstood, was the sight of children, or even adults, speaking to beings no one else could see. You would notice it first in children. A boy sits by the well, chattering away, pointing at empty space as if answering questions. A girl in the courtyard converses softly, tilting her head toward a shadow cast by a beam, laughing when no one else is near. To modern eyes, it might appear innocent or playful, even imaginative. But in the medieval mindset, invisible companions were often a sign of spiritual interference, moral weakness, or potential madness. This perspective arose from the medieval belief that the visible and invisible worlds were deeply intertwined. Spirits, angels, and demons were thought to roam freely alongside humans, occasionally influencing thought and behavior. If a child spoke to shadows or invisible beings, adults worried. Was this an angel guiding them, a demon testing them, or a sign that the child's mind was unbalanced? The distinction mattered because every action was interpreted through the lens of survival, morality, and faith. In daily life, such children were carefully observed. Parents, neighbors, and teachers monitored interactions, noting when the child laughed alone, when they gestured at nothing, or when they seemed to respond to commands from the unseen. Conversations with invisible companions were not dismissed as imagination. They were scrutinized for meaning. Could the child be privy to secret knowledge? Could they be communicating with something dangerous? Adults displaying similar behaviors faced even more suspicion. A man seen speaking quietly to shadows at the edge of the marketplace might be labeled strange, unstable, or possessed. A woman who consulted unseen figures in her home could draw whispers of sorcery. In villages where rumors traveled fast and fear of the supernatural was strong, these behaviors could subtly isolate the individual. Work invitations declined, social interactions shortened, and distance became a protective barrier for both the observer and the observed. Monasteries offered a different, but no less cautious, perspective. Here, speaking to invisible companions could be interpreted as spiritual experience. Some monks were believed to commune with angels or visions granted by divine grace. Yet the line between revered vision and dangerous delusion was thin. A novice who reported hearing voices or seeing companions invisible to others might be examined carefully, tested through fasting, prayer, or instruction, and guided to determine whether these experiences were holy, delusional, or the result of moral failing. Medical understanding in this period offered little explanation. Humoral theory sometimes attributed such visions to imbalances of bile, blood, or phlegm. A heated imagination could be blamed on an excess of blood, melancholy on a surplus of black bile. Remedies might include calming herbs, dietary adjustments, or changes in routine, yet these interventions rarely addressed the social or spiritual interpretations that dominated perception. Imagine a child at dusk, walking through the empty village streets, conversing softly with shadows. Adults watch from windows, unsure whether to intervene. A priest crosses himself, mutters a prayer, and continues on. A neighbor pauses, cautious not to startle the unseen presence, and the child continues, untroubled, oblivious to the scrutiny that surrounds them. What is particularly striking is how quickly ordinary life could be reshaped around these behaviors. Parents and neighbors adapted routines, creating space for the child's unseen companions. Streets were avoided, tasks adjusted, conversations shifted to accommodate the extraordinary presence, even if only in silence. While the behavior was observed with caution, it also quietly taught patience, observation, and a kind of social negotiation rarely recorded in formal history. The lasting effect of this phenomenon is subtle but significant. Invisible companions, real or imagined, became a lens through which communities interpreted morality, mental health, and spiritual connection. Stories circulated in quiet whispers: a child saved by a shadowy friend, a man warned of danger by unseen guidance, a woman cursed after consulting invisible forces. These narratives shaped communal expectations of normalcy and deviance alike. By the end of the first stage of observation, one question lingers in the mind of anyone witnessing these behaviors: if some companions are invisible yet real in the mind of the individual, who ultimately defines their reality, the observer, the participant, or the world between? As the village moves into midday, life continues around the children and adults who speak to invisible companions, yet their behaviors now attract deeper scrutiny and subtle intervention. By this stage, the novelty has worn off, and the community begins to categorize and respond more systematically, even if only intuitively. Invisible companions are no longer seen purely as curiosity. They are signals of morality, of mental state, or of spiritual influence. Parents often attempt gentle correction. They instruct the child to speak to people, rather than shadows. They redirect play, assign chores, or encourage prayer. Yet, the unseen companions are persistent. They fill the quiet moments and accompany the child through daily routines. The child might pause mid-task to consult a shadow, nodding or gesturing as though receiving guidance. Such behavior is both tolerated and noted. It is a delicate balance. Parents seek to maintain social norms while avoiding outright confrontation, which could provoke fear or rebellion. In monastic settings, adults experiencing similar phenomena are subject to greater scrutiny. A monk claiming to hear guidance from invisible beings could be revered or feared, depending on context. Superiors would test the individual's obedience, discipline, and alignment with doctrine. Structured prayer, fasting, and solitary reflection were prescribed to determine whether the voice was divine or dangerous. Failure to comply could result in isolation or corrective labor. Yet those who appeared receptive and disciplined might be seen as touched by spiritual insight, their unseen companions framed as blessings rather than threats. The social consequences for those outside religious institutions were more complex. Villagers interpreted invisible companions as both a potential blessing and a risk. A woman who appeared to converse with unseen beings while weaving at her loom might be sought for counsel in times of uncertainty, yet simultaneously avoided in casual social encounters for fear of unpredictable influence. Men and women navigating these interactions had to develop nuanced social strategies, listening respectfully without engagement, creating distance without insult, and acknowledging the unseen without pretending to share its presence. Medical explanations remained rudimentary and largely secondary to spiritual interpretation. Humoral theory attributed unusual visions or speech to imbalances in the body. Black bile might induce melancholic imaginings. Excessive blood could heighten excitability. Phlegm might cloud reason. Remedies included herbal teas, careful dietary adjustments, and physical interventions such as gentle confinement or massage. In rare cases, early physicians attempted to understand the psychological toll, observing that children who spent long hours with unseen companions sometimes slept poorly, spoke rapidly, or exhibited signs of fatigue. These interventions often had limited effect, because the behaviors were deeply rooted in cognitive and emotional patterns beyond the medieval understanding of health. The unseen companions filled psychological needs: comfort, guidance, and interaction in a world that could be isolating, especially for children or socially marginalized individuals. In this sense, the companions were adaptive, even as they attracted scrutiny, fear, and misunderstanding. Stories of such individuals circulated quietly, preserved in local memory or anecdotal records. Tales describe children guided to safety by invisible voices, adults forewarned of danger, or people whose unseen friends warned them against wrongdoing. These accounts reinforced social norms, highlighting the duality of the phenomenon, both protective and precarious. Observers interpreted what they could see and assumed intentions for what they could not. The persistence of invisible companions also shaped the social and moral education of children. Observing a peer interact with a shadowy figure taught lessons in caution, humility, and attentiveness. It reinforced ideas of spiritual awareness while subtly promoting conformity to social expectations. Children learned to respect difference while internalizing the fear of deviation from communal norms. The invisible companions also prompted philosophical and spiritual reflection among clerics and scholars. Some argued that such behaviors were signs of divine communication. Others warned of moral corruption or spiritual vulnerability. Manuals on proper behavior advised parents and priests alike to monitor the influence of unseen companions carefully, emphasizing moderation, discipline, and communal oversight. Yet the essential mystery remained: the internal experience of the individual was inaccessible, leaving all interpretations provisional. As evening approaches, the invisible companions continue their quiet work, guiding, entertaining, or comforting their human counterparts. The village settles into routine. Adults return from labor. Children gather around fires, some still speaking to figures no one else perceives. Observers adjust their expectations, maintaining vigilance without full comprehension, preserving a delicate balance between acceptance and concern. And still, a question lingers in the shadowed corners of memory and observation. If the unseen companions shaped the inner world of individuals, providing guidance, comfort, or even survival strategies, how much of what we call reality belongs to the observer, and how much to the participant, whose mind contains entire worlds invisible to others? As night falls on the medieval village, the stories of invisible companions reach a subtle, enduring conclusion. Children and adults alike, who conversed with beings unseen by others, continue their quiet routines. To the casual observer, nothing has changed. Yet beneath the surface, lives have been shaped by the presence of these companions, whether imagined, spiritual, or a combination of both. For many, invisible companions were a source of solace and guidance. In a world with few formal educational opportunities, little social mobility, and frequent danger from disease or famine, these unseen figures became confidants, advisors, and playmates. Children relied on them to navigate daily challenges, while adults sometimes used their imagined guidance to make sense of the uncertainties surrounding them. The companions helped fill gaps in understanding and social support, offering a form of quiet resilience that no medieval manual could prescribe. Yet this comfort came with consequences. Adults and neighbors often interpreted the behavior as strange or dangerous, leading to subtle isolation. Invitations to gatherings were fewer, casual conversations were curtailed, observation replaced interaction, and social bonds became conditional. Still, individuals with unseen companions adapted. They learned to navigate a world that simultaneously feared and depended on their differences. Paths through the village were carefully chosen. Words were sometimes directed to human interlocutors, sometimes reserved for the unseen. In this delicate balance, the participants maintained their agency, even in a society that could not fully comprehend their inner lives. Within religious contexts, the outcomes were similarly mixed. Monks or nuns, who reported interaction with invisible companions, were sometimes elevated, seen as spiritually attuned, or given special guidance. Others were disciplined, confined, or instructed to redirect their attention to prescribed prayers and work. Clerical interpretation was as much about social order as spiritual insight. The line between devotion, delusion, and danger was never clear, and each case was negotiated according to context, reputation, and adherence to communal expectations. The stories preserved in chronicles, sermons, and moral lessons emphasized not the internal experience but the external effect. Companions unseen became metaphors for discipline, moral vigilance, and the human capacity to maintain routine in the presence of invisible pressures. They shaped expectations of normal behavior, subtly teaching children patience, caution, and respect for unseen forces, whether divine, demonic, or imaginative. Remarkably, these invisible companions also reveal a medieval understanding of human psychology, albeit without the terminology or scientific framework we have today. They demonstrate that medieval society recognized patterns of thought and behavior that deviated from the norm, interpreted them in moral and spiritual terms, and created social and religious strategies to accommodate, manage, or redirect them. In doing so, communities ensured survival, cohesion, and order, even when individual experience remained largely inaccessible. Over time, the invisible companions faded from the conscious attention of the village, but their influence persisted. Children grew into adults with memories of their guidance, lessons, and companionship. Adults adapted to social norms while retaining the private comfort of their inner worlds. The village itself, in observing and managing these behaviors, learned subtle lessons in tolerance, adaptation, and the quiet endurance of difference. And so, the unresolved reflection remains. In a society that could neither fully understand nor name the experiences of those who spoke to unseen beings, what was truly remarkable was not the presence of invisible companions, but the resilience, adaptation, and survival of the individuals themselves. They endured scrutiny, fear, and isolation, yet found in the invisible a companion for growth, reflection, and solace, a silent testament to the complexity of human life and imagination in medieval times. Imagine a small medieval household, just as twilight descends. The fire burns low in the hearth, sending flickering shadows across rough-hewn walls. The family has finished the evening meal, and the children have been tucked into straw-filled beds covered with rough blankets. The adults settle in near the hearth, perhaps with a small lamp of tallow or a candle. Outside, the village is silent, punctuated only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant call of an owl. In this quiet world, sleep is both a necessity and a source of danger. Medieval people believed that the night held real, active threats, both spiritual and physical. The shadows that flickered across walls were not mere tricks of the fire. They were potential entrances for demons, restless spirits, or evil forces seeking to tempt or harm the living. Sleep, therefore, was far from a passive state. It was a moment when the soul could be invaded, tested, or influenced. Children were particularly vulnerable. If a child cried out in the night, parents often interpreted it not simply as discomfort or fear, but as evidence that something unseen was attempting to reach them. Nightmares, terrifying visions, or sudden awakenings were understood as signs that the spiritual world was pressing against the veil, separating it from the mortal realm. The medieval mind did not divide imagination, psychology, and the supernatural in the ways we do today. One could not simply dream. A dream could be a warning, a visitation, or a subtle form of punishment. To prevent these nocturnal invasions, families used a variety of protective measures. Amulets, charms, and religious symbols were common. A crucifix might be hung on the bedpost. Prayers were whispered before sleep. Herbs like rue, rosemary, or thyme were sometimes scattered in bedding to ward off evil spirits. Even simple gestures, closing doors, covering the head with blankets, or placing a small light nearby, were acts of both practical and spiritual precaution. The goal was to create a safe environment, but also to assert some control over the mysterious forces thought to roam at night. Adults, too, were not immune to these fears. Nightmares were sometimes interpreted as moral or spiritual signals. A bad dream might suggest sinfulness, temptation, or a warning from God. Clergy were called upon to interpret particularly vivid or disturbing dreams, reading meaning into each shadow, sound, or sensation. Manuals and sermons describe in detail how to guard against nocturnal dangers, emphasizing the importance of prayer, vigilance, and the correct positioning of the body and mind before sleep. Beyond spiritual concerns, sleep in medieval times was physically precarious. Houses were drafty, and warmth was scarce. Beds were simple, often shared by multiple family members. Infants, children, and adults alike faced the risks of cold, damp, and illness. Nighttime disturbances, whether caused by real-world threats or perceived spiritual attacks, added a layer of anxiety to an already vulnerable state. Sleep, then, was never fully peaceful. It was a period in which the ordinary and extraordinary overlapped. Some households maintained routines to mitigate nighttime fears. Stories were read or told, lessons repeated, and prayers recited in unison. Family members might gather to share protective rituals, ensuring that everyone participated in the spiritual defense of the household. The fire, always tended, became both a literal and symbolic barrier, its light asserting safety in a world filled with shadows. Even the architecture of houses reflected concern for night and sleep. Beds were positioned away from doors or windows, corners were filled with objects of protection, and small, carefully maintained shrines or holy images were placed nearby. Every aspect of the sleeping environment was a negotiation between comfort, safety, and spiritual security. And yet, despite all precautions, nightmares and nocturnal disturbances remained common. Medieval observers did not always record these events systematically, but scattered notes, diaries, and chronicles indicate their frequency. People slept uneasily, waking suddenly, muttering prayers, or seeking reassurance from others. The experience was intensely private, yet culturally framed within a shared understanding of the dangers inherent to night. From a modern perspective, it is striking how deeply intertwined sleep, fear, and spirituality were. Nightmares were not merely psychological events. They were messages, tests, and reflections of a larger moral and cosmic order. Individuals lived in constant negotiation with their dreams, their fears, and the unseen forces believed to populate the night. And so, as you picture a family settling into bed in a quiet medieval home, a subtle question arises. If sleep was a time when the soul was vulnerable to spirits and moral lessons, what inner strength or resilience did ordinary people develop simply to survive the long, dark nights? As darkness deepens over the village, sleep does not come easily for most medieval people. The body, weary from labor in the fields, workshops, or kitchens, might crave rest, yet the mind remains alert to unseen threats. The night is alive with sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of timber settling, the sigh of wind through narrow streets. Each ordinary noise could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual disturbance. Children were the most vulnerable to these interpretations, but adults were not exempt. A farmer waking in a sweat after a dream of fire or flood might believe he was being warned of divine displeasure, or even that spirits were attempting to influence him for good or ill. Housewives murmuring prayers to calm a restless infant were participating in a form of early psychological care, though one deeply entwined with superstition. Sleep, then, was simultaneously a necessity, a vulnerability, and a lesson in vigilance. Families and communities developed complex routines to guard against nocturnal threats. Prayers were standardized, a sequence of words repeated precisely to ward off spiritual intrusion. Holy water might be sprinkled around sleeping areas, and amulets were carefully positioned on beds or in corners. The protective measures were layered: physical, spiritual, and social. One family might sleep together in a single room, forming a barrier of collective warmth and shared vigilance, while another might place an elder near a child, believing experience could help shield innocence from unseen forces. At the same time, the night taught resilience and endurance. People learned to interpret their own dreams cautiously, to distinguish between ordinary fatigue and perceived messages from the spirit world. Chroniclers note instances where children or adults experienced repeated night terrors yet developed coping mechanisms, muttering prayers in sleep, performing small protective rituals, or seeking reassurance from family members. These practices were practical and psychological, even if embedded in religious and cultural frameworks. Monasteries, where sleep was regulated by bell schedules and prayer obligations, provide another perspective. Monks and nuns were acutely aware of the dangers of spiritual distraction during the night. Some recorded experiences of visions and nightmares, often interpreting them as tests of faith or opportunities for moral growth. Sleep was structured, almost regimented, with repeated prayers and physical positions believed to maintain spiritual focus. Monks might wake multiple times each night to pray, and any dream that deviated from the expected pattern was examined carefully, with interpretation offered to maintain both personal and communal discipline. Interestingly, the fear of nighttime disturbances also shaped social behavior in more subtle ways. Villagers learned to speak softly at dusk, to avoid leaving lights unattended, and to respect the privacy of neighbors' houses. Social norms emerged around the recognition that night was not merely a time of rest, but a shared period of vulnerability. Families took turns watching children, ensuring that the spiritual and physical dangers of darkness did not go unchecked. The ordinary routines of life became intertwined with a constant awareness of unseen presence and potential threat. Nightmares themselves were interpreted in layers of meaning. A fire in a dream might signal sin, greed, or anger. Falling could reflect moral instability or divine testing. Repeated visions of animals, wolves, snakes, or crows, were associated with spiritual trials or impending misfortune. Manuals and sermons advised not only prayer but attention to physical behavior. Fasting, proper diet, and positioning during sleep were all believed to influence the quality of dreams and the resistance to nocturnal invasion. In addition to spiritual interpretation, night offered a lesson in endurance. The mind learned to navigate fear while maintaining the necessity of rest. The body became resilient through repeated exposure to discomfort and vigilance. Children who grew up under such conditions were trained early to recognize patterns, to distinguish noise from threat, and to develop routines that could accommodate both ordinary life and extraordinary belief. Even when a nightmare passed without incident, the memory of it remained, shaping decisions, behavior, and social norms. Sleep became a negotiation between mind, body, and unseen forces. The medieval individual existed in a constant interplay between necessity, fear, and adaptation. Each night reinforced resilience, not in dramatic gestures but in quiet endurance, measured attention, and repeated action. And yet, for all the coping strategies, a lingering thought remains. If the night was a time when minds were both vulnerable and tested, how much of the quiet strength of ordinary medieval people was forged not in labor or battle, but in the silent hours of darkness, confronting fears no one else could see? As the medieval night continued its slow passage over villages, fields, and monasteries, the small rituals, prayers, and protective measures of ordinary people shaped lives in ways rarely recorded in chronicles. Sleep, so often taken for granted today, was for them an arena of vulnerability and endurance, a space where courage, imagination, and resilience were quietly forged. Children who once cried out in terror or conversed with unseen presences gradually learned strategies for coping. Some developed private rituals, softly repeating prayers, clutching a familiar object, or whispering to an imaginary guardian, techniques that offered comfort and a semblance of control. The unseen companions or shadowy figures of nightmares became a framework through which young minds practiced courage and developed awareness of boundaries, both internal and external. These lessons were subtle but enduring, shaping the temperament, creativity, and adaptability of the next generation. Adults, too, honed their resilience through nightly vigilance. Farmers, artisans, and housewives cultivated habits that allowed them to remain attentive to danger, both real and imagined, without succumbing to fear. The physical conditions of medieval homes, drafts, cold, and minimal bedding, demanded fortitude. The psychological demands of a world teeming with spiritual hazards reinforced self-discipline and careful observation. In enduring these nightly challenges, ordinary people became adept at balancing survival, belief, and social cohesion. Monastic routines amplified this training. The regular waking for prayer, careful attention to dreams, and continuous moral reflection during sleep nurtured both spiritual focus and mental stamina. Monks and nuns learned to navigate internal experiences, distinguishing between inspiration and delusion, divine guidance and misperception. Their lives illustrate how structure, repetition, and ritual can transform vulnerability into endurance, creating resilience within the confines of human limitation. The broader society absorbed these lessons in subtler ways. Families developed shared understandings about nighttime care, creating informal networks to protect children, elderly or vulnerable neighbors. Social behavior adapted to the rhythms of night. Doors were closed thoughtfully, footsteps softened, and watchfulness became communal. These adaptations, born of fear and superstition, reinforced cohesion, empathy, and practical foresight, even in the absence of modern psychological insight. And yet, the medieval understanding of sleep, nightmares, and unseen threats remained incomplete. Dreams, restless movement, and nocturnal fear were interpreted in moral or spiritual terms, rather than as internal psychological experiences. What endured, however, was the cultivation of quiet resilience, the ability to face uncertainty, discomfort, and internal turbulence without collapse. The night, for all its dangers, became a teacher, shaping endurance and character in ways both subtle and profound. As the village awoke, the children and adults carried the lessons of the night into daily life: vigilance, patience, caution, and the ability to negotiate fear without surrender. The experiences of a medieval household, though easily dismissed as superstition, reveal a remarkable adaptation to environmental, social, and spiritual pressures. People survived, thrived, and transmitted knowledge in the absence of formal medicine or scientific understanding. And so, the unresolved reflection remains. If the quiet struggle against darkness and unseen forces could forge resilience, courage, and adaptability, what might we learn from these forgotten fears today? How much of human endurance is shaped not in grand battles or triumphs, but in the intimate, shadowed spaces where ordinary people confront the unseen, the unknown, and the uncontrollable?